It's exciting. We haven't done this for so long. Well,
And I appreciate your
thanks.
accommodating me.
Yeah, of course, Frank. Thank you so much. We're just starting our first digital salon, I think in over a year, our first post-talk digital
Wow.
salon. And this is part of a series that we are doing with Galileo, which is a healthcare company based out of New York City, but they're providing healthcare across the country. I have got two guests with me today. One co-hosting with me is Caroline Manning, who's an executive at Galileo, and Frank Keil, who's our guest of honor today. And he's professor of psychology at Yale, where he's part of the Cognition and Development Lab. How long have you been there over at Yale, Frank?
I came in 1998. I was at Cornell for 21 years before. It's Keil, by the way, my last name.
Keil. Okay. Well, thank you. Right.
Everyone gets it wrong. Don't worry. You're in the majority.
What is the background of that name, Keil?
It's German,
where is it from?
and in German you tend to do.
Of course. I did terribly in German. I think I failed my German class.
I never took it.
Well, there you go. Okay, there you go. Well, let's start off as people start kind of joining the conversation, because we are recording this live. When I first emailed you, Frank, about coming to a salon, I'd suggested doing this in New York City, and you replied that you and your wife had hosted something similar to a salon at Yale. Can you tell us what they were like?
So we were asked to be heads of one of Yale's residential colleges, which meant living with roughly 400 students.
Wow.
We had a separate house, which was very nice. It was a freestanding, actually very large house, designed by Eero Saarinen. So it was a gorgeous house, modern house. Mm-hmm. But students all around us. And one of the things that we really loved was hosting masters' teas. They don't call them masters anymore, they're called heads. But we hosted a lot. And we hosted maybe 20 a year.
Wow. Did they have different topics, or was it just a gathering of the students and faculty?
All over the world, the guests would come and people were invited. If it was a rock star, we'd have to, literally sometimes it was a rock star like Art Garfunkel.
Oh my gosh, how special.
We'd have to regulate the attendance. But it was the highlight of my 11 years, because I would read everyone's works or books or their music, whatever they did, and really prepare. And then we'd take them out to dinner at a place called Maury's, which is around the corner. And it was a full event. And we had everybody from right wing to left wing to unknown people. We had one guest who you've never heard of, who had been the last survivor of his village in Rwanda and had
the
survived.
Last survivor. Wow.
Survived
and still made it to New Haven.
His teachers had turned on him and macheted most of his classmates. And it was just an amazing story. And he wanted to go back to forgive them. So it was an amazing experience. Now, sadly, those have not happened so much since the pandemic. The heads of the colleges are so busy now, they have not been able to do it. And of course, you can't bring in visitors. But I hope they revive, because I learned so much.
Hopefully. I went maybe a month or two, probably a couple of months ago, and was given a tour of the new Schwartzman Student Center at Yale. So I'm sure they're going to be doing many, many gatherings there. Anyway, for those who have just joined, I know folks are just joining us now. I've got Frank Keil here, who is professor of psychology at Yale University, and he's part of the Cognition and Development Lab, and Caroline Manning, who's an executive at Galileo. And this is part of the Galileo series of salons that we're co-hosting with them. Let's see if I can do this in front of the camera. Here is Frank's new book. It's called Wonder. When did it come out? Is it just come out, or is it almost out?
Just a few weeks ago.
Just a few weeks ago. Great. Yeah. Well, here it is. It came out from MIT Press. And I'm going to start off. I feel like that this book is really a love letter to wonder, awe, and your time working in science. That's how it came across to me, is really a love letter a little bit.
It was more, I got more passionate about it than I thought I would at first. It was really, I've written several books, but this one really got me going, and it became kind of a thing that obsessed me. And
what was the spark, Frank? Like what sparked the idea?
I was thinking about it, and I think there are a lot of things. I mean, one was watching my own children and their extraordinary curiosity about the world. Then my three granddaughters, who are now 3 and 1 and 1, a pair of twins, and the way they explore the world. And as I also in my own research and research of colleagues, I saw this extraordinary ability being discovered in young children before they hit school. So before children even start formal schooling, they are very, very gifted at ferreting out the causal structure of the world. They're very gifted at learning how to navigate the division of cognitive labor. Who knows what around them, who to trust, who to defer to, and so on. And between age 4 and 5, their why and how questions skyrocket. Some classic reports say that children, by the time they're end of the 4th year, are asking up to 100 why questions now. And they're not annoying.
Wow.
And they're not annoying why questions. They are real, honest to God why questions. And we
Mhm.
know that because if you give them a bad answer, like suppose a kid says something like, why does thunder come after the lightning? And you say, yes, that's right. That noisy sound comes after the bright light. They'll say back to you, no, that's what I asked. I want to know why. And so they push
So
until they get the answer.
wonder
Okay.
seems to be so strong when we're young, and then it seems to go away a little bit, and then as we get older, it seems as if it reappears.
Well,
Why does that seem to reappear? And does it? It starts at young kids and then they get old age?
This is the other part about why I wrote the book. The crushing thing was that about the time they hit school, it collapses. This was documented back in the 1960s and 70s by Keil and Martin Hughes. They went from 100 questions an hour to 2 or 3 or 0. And just boom. And it often never revived. You go into an elementary school or a high school or a college and beyond, and you'll see relatively few kids or adults trying to dig deeper into mechanism. You can revive it, and I do a lot of cases and examples of how to and when it's happened, but it's not sadly happened enough. And wonder is very unusual because it's an act of incredible humility because you're admitting you don't know something, but also kind of adventurousness and exuberance. So it's this weird combination, that's what I love about it. Because you're confessing you don't know something, but you're also being daring by speculating.
Can kids understand complex concepts?
Yeah, far more than we think. They can't verbalize them, but they can show their knowledge, and it's surprising. I'll tell you one study that we did in our lab. There's lots of other labs, but this one I still remain fascinated by. You show children who can't even speak, say 11-month-olds, a disordered scene, say a messy bedroom, all the toys and clothes all scattered all over it. And then a screen comes up, and either a ball rolls behind the screen or a little person rolls behind the screen. Screen comes down, and the room's neatly ordered. The babies who are watching this are really surprised if that ball did it. But if it goes from ordered to disordered, they're not surprised at all. So they know that only intentional agents can create order out of disorder, but anything can create disorder out of order. Now, just to even say that is a mouthful, but before they can speak, they know this. And there are now hundreds of studies of infants and preverbal children showing these kinds of capacities.
You just said you had twins that are 1. What are they doing right now that might demonstrate this?
Well, they're twin girls, but they're fraternal twins, and they're remarkably different. Poppy and Marin. And Poppy they were named in utero, and the one who was more active on top, they named Poppy, and she sure is.
Really? Wow.
And Marin is much more quiet and reflective, wonderfully different and exciting personalities. Poppy is absolutely determined to figure out how things work in enormous detail. She keeps manipulating things to figure out what's with them. Marin likes to sit back and study things, more interested in perhaps how people behave. So very different attitudes, but they're both very exploratory. And it's just fun to watch. There's different styles or different ways of approaching phenomena, and they exhibit it. I'd never seen kids so different who share the same environment.
Do you think that you're more tapped into that, Frank? Like tapped into being able to identify that in them because of the work that you do, or because you're a grandparent and not so much in the weeds of parenting?
No.
Or
being a grandparent is very interesting, and some of the great developmental psychologists of the past have often had their greatest insights later in life when they weren't so wrapped up in parenting.
Exactly that.
And
Right.
so yeah, absolutely. And maybe having done this for I've been a professor since 1977, so I've been doing this a long time. And so, yeah, I've watched a lot of kids. But to be honest, I think I've learned a lot from my wife, who is also an academic, and she has a much more gifted lens on kids. But yeah, I think I can see a few things. And in the grandkids, especially, because you have none of the duties and all the joy. Grandkids are pretty neat stuff.
You write, so much of this book is about, wonder around science.
That's right.
If a parent or a teacher doesn't feel confident in science, say, a first or second grade teacher, so still quite young, or maybe even ignorant about science, a parent, of which many parents probably are, how does that affect the kids and their relationship with science as they grow?
It's a great question. It's a big issue. Here's one problem. Kids can smell anxiety and nervousness about science. They know if the teacher's uncomfortable. If the parents think the girls aren't good in math, the girls will not be good in math. They sense it, and they fulfill that awful promise, which it shouldn't be that way. But it doesn't have to be that way. You have to tell people that science is within everybody's grasp if you pitch it the right way. One of the things I talk about the book at length is teaching science through history. And I had a science teacher as a kid who was remarkable. He went through the historical evolution, almost all scientific discoveries and technology, and somehow managed to pack it all in the same time. But the reason why that's so good is if you're scared of science and you go back far enough in history, it becomes very simple and transparent. I'll give you one example. I recently got interested in electromagnetism for complex reasons, related to a question my granddaughter asked, actually. But as I got into it, I went back and looked briefly at Maxwell's equations because I hit those in college. I said, I can't fathom these anymore. So let me go back one generation prior and look at people who did it more simply. And now I'm blanking on his name, but it'll come back to me. There are people who, prior to Maxwell, didn't use any math at all. They just looked at Faraday, Michael Faraday, who was this astonishing inventor and discoverer of electricity. He was a blacksmith son.
Right.
Who
Oh my
went
gosh,
to
I haven't heard that name since I was in school.
who went to London and could barely survive economically, but started playing around with magnets, running currents by compasses and doing stuff. And if you're afraid of science, you should read his stuff. You should read his notebooks. There's nothing hard. There's no fancy vocabulary. But then Maxwell, who was very mathy, came along and said, Faraday's my inspiration. He's the ground for everything. And you can do it in all the different sciences. You have to be careful because you get led astray. You might believe in a Earth-centered version of the universe, but that's actually interesting. So I think everyone can be fascinated. The fact that 3-year-olds can do it and 4-year-olds can do it means any teacher can do it. But our education system doesn't allow it. When you're teaching a class of 25 or 30 children, you're reduced to asking about facts. You can't ask them how and why questions. You can't dive into.
Why is that? Just the volume, Frank, that you would get, or the time, or the expectation of what someone needs, what a teacher needs to cover?
All that, the standardized tests. If you look at it's a very interesting disconnect. The next generation science standards, which I had some hand in helping work on designing ideals for it, are all about wonderful things like deep concepts, calls, understanding mechanism. But when those get implemented in the schools and translated into tests, they're almost all about facts. You know, how many legs does a spider have, and so on. They're not about how does this work or why is this way. And that's very hard to test, and because you have to do essays. It's very hard to do in a standardized way. So that the teachers are reduced to getting these kids to answer facts, which they don't like. It's not as much fun. It's not as much fun to teach. And there's not enough time to have a protracted conversation. One of the things that was discovered when Tizard and Hughes did their studies way back in the 60s was this wasn't a social class phenomenon. All social classes had this problem of not really having good conversations with their kids. And
is there a way to ask better questions?
Absolutely.
For kids? And can you tell us how to do it? Because I'm sure there's many parents listening now, and we'll
the
make
whole
a
last chapter
podcast
of my
out
book,
of this.
the whole last chapter of my book goes through many examples.
Right.
One very simple thing is to simply be sure you ask open-ended questions. Don't say,
okay,
how many is this, or is this yes, no responses. Ask them to explain why or how, or speculate. You have to also often confess your own ignorance. Never try to fake it with a kid. If they don't know something, that's exciting. That's a wonderful thing. And I work on this with undergraduates all the time. I have to train them to be delighted to discover a hole in their knowledge, not to be embarrassed. And so if parents can realize that you're partners in discovery, you're not exactly equivalent partners, you're more of a senior partner, but still. So to get back to the electromagnetism example, my granddaughter, the 3-year-old, Frances, asked me, well, she made a statement about the planets and claimed that Mercury was not the hottest planet. I was sure it was because it was closest to the sun. She said, no, it's Venus. I said, how could that be? And she corrected me. I thought Venus was actually just like Earth, just a little hotter, but it's the evil twin. It has an Earth temperature, it has a surface temperature of 850 degrees Fahrenheit. And I've gotten this rabbit hole of learning about the planets and magnetic fields and how they shield the atmosphere and why some do and don't. And that's how I got into that. But that all was triggered by my 3-year-old granddaughter asking a question. And listening to her, thinking with her, wondering with her is a habit of mind that you start to develop. And it's fun. It's another example would be, we used to live in Ithaca. We lived on a cliff overlooking a lake, really high cliff. And as you walk down the lake on these really rickety stairs, there was shale and little fossils would break off all the way down. And we would loiter next to the places where the fossils broke off often deliberately and let our children explore them a bit. So when you see a little spot that is exposed something interesting or exciting, that really triggers interest in exploration. So I have lots of tips. It's not hard. A little bit, checklist, a little bit of metacognitive thinking about it, but it becomes automatic after a while because it's so rewarding. It's not a duty, it's a joy. Sorry to talk so long.
No. That's okay. If for folks who are watching live, if you have any questions, it should work. If you put them into the comments, we'll be able to ask them. So
I'm going to
please
count
do
on
that.
you to read those because I'm not
Oh
very
yeah,
good.
yeah. No worries. We'll definitely do that. So what is the relationship between wonder and science for adults as
So
time goes on in
this
middle life?
is a very interesting and complex issue. I focus on the hard sciences mostly: biology, physics, chemistry, and technology. I don't focus so much on the social sciences and humanities, although they're certainly relevant. But part of the reason is because kids are particularly interested in mechanism, something like what you might call the clockworks of the world. It's almost a spatial thing. They want to see how the world lays itself out. They want to
Kids
look
go
inside.
crazy for science museums, right? I remember when I was a child. Carolyn, did you ever go to those science museums?
And
Yeah, we had a lot near me.
Yeah.
I discussed that at some length because some science museums fail a little bit by having gee whiz pop shows, but they don't then tell you why. The great science museums unpack. So you've probably been to science museums where the hair stands on end of a Van de Graaff generator, but how often do they explain what's going on? If they just do that first part and that's all the kid remembers, then it's making science look like a magic show. It's not. It's more.
Okay.
It's more something where if you practice a little bit like a musical instrument, many more delights come. And so I talk about one actually in Ithaca where I first was. It was founded by two ladies who had spent 20 years working in the elementary schools, trying to inspire kids on their own time after school to get into science. And they started this whole science center, which is an amazing place. It is exactly what it should be. And you can do it right, but it has to be done right.
What do you think, Frank, about, we had some friends over yesterday evening. We have two kids, 9 and 7, and we were having
A very curious age, though, right, Carolyn?
Curious age, yeah.
Super
we get a lot of
curious
whys.
age.
And what I find us doing in our more tired moments is not really getting into debate, but finding an answer. We're like, well, Google knows the answer to this. We can just look it up, and everybody is, jumping on their phones to figure out the answer. I'm wondering what your experience of, like, whether technology has really dampened the opportunity to explore wonder and to be in kind of unknowing and debate around it.
It's a perfect question. I have so much to say about it. First of all, a number of students I teach a seminar on related topics say to me, I don't need to know all this stuff. I can just Google it. And so why do I need it? I said, wondering gives you all this wonderful understanding. And they say, so what? I can just Google it. And the point I try to make is you can't. First of all, you don't know how to Google things. You don't know have a sense of where the information is. But more importantly, you don't have in your head at the same time in a discussion these models to shuffle and play with. When I have a lab meeting and we discuss some research topic, we can't each time turn to a computer and look up something to continue the discussion. We have to have the alternatives in our heads. When I'm having a discussion with you now, if you said, what did you think of this? And I have to go look it up and then look it up. That would drive me crazy. We would stall the discussion. It's like the old debate on math, addition or subtraction. People said, don't have kids learn times tables and addition tables because you can hold it in the calculator. Well, it turned out when you stop doing that, they've had no sense of the layout of math, the structure of math. They have no sense of numbers. And so in a long-winded way saying is you really have to get some simplified abstract models of how the world works, some sense, not all the details, to have really vigorous investigations and to know where to look, to know what experts to pay attention to. The second part of your question was about modern technology. I have another section of the book where I think, sadly, the glory of discovering mechanism is disappearing. The example I go on at length on, and I'm just writing a longer piece on it still, is when I was in college as a freshman, I bought a 63 Triumph Spitfire, still one of the world's greatest cars. But it was a terrible shape. I got it for almost nothing, and I had to fix it.
You had to tinker. You had
A
an
lot of
opportunity to tinker.
And the whole repair manual was, I was trying to find a book. It was a thin kind of book. It was like maybe 3/4 of an inch thick. It had every single nut and bolt and part depicted with a little paragraph of what it did. And you could take it all apart, and I could wander down to the nearby junkyard and fix it. And so that's what I was able to do. And today, the same looking car, a Mazda Miata, has 2 to 5 billion transistors. Mine had 0 transistors because the radio was broken. And so you open up a Mazda Miata's hood, and it's just boxes, plastic boxes with two. You open up the bonnet of my Spitfire, as the British used to call it, and everything was there. You could see every single part. That's true for toasters. Old-fashioned toasters were marvelously gorgeous devices. And today, there's solid-state circuits. It's true for old TVs. And almost all the stuff where you could explore and learn have been taken away from us and being embedded in silicon. And so I think that's unfortunate. There are movements to try to restore some of this, but they're not that successful. And so
What
I don't know.
happens?
Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, what happens to our sense of time and space when we feel wonder as adults or as children?
Interesting. I don't know. I think we get drawn up and maybe everything slows down a bit. It's kind of like, there's this concept of being in flow or perhaps even mindfulness. There's an absorption. And I think you just so zero into what you're focusing on. Maybe it slows down. I think it does, but I'm not sure. It depends what you're looking at, probably.
I think it's maybe easier to feel wonder when you're in nature than, say, New York City. Perhaps today it would be a good day for people in New York City to try and find wonder.
Nature is everywhere, but you're right. I'll tell you an example of what's happened with me as a result of writing this book and teaching a seminar on a related topic. I see spring more vividly every year. So I've learned through reading and having my students make presentations about how the very first flowers manage to break through frost. I've learned about how birds have their parts of the brain swell when they're about to sing songs. I've learned about, I could go on and on. I learned about how just today, I was wondering why daffodils are among the first, and I learned that flowers with bulbs tend to be the first. I have to research tonight about why bulbs give them that advantage. But suddenly spring is much more three-dimensional and elaborate for me. And the analogy I use is it's like getting new lenses, seeing more depth and color. I had my cataracts removed last spring, and it was the same thing. Suddenly the world popped. It was sharper, more colorful. That's what causal understanding does. Keats Dawkins criticized the poet Keats because he said that Newton ruined the romance and mystery of the rainbow by deciphering it with a prism. But that was actually an incorrect sort of a description of Keats. Keats was a medical student. He loved science. He was musing about that. But in many of his other poems, he delighted in love science. And there's a marvelous book about all that by Richard Holmes called The Age of Wonder, where at the end of the Enlightenment,
right?
These romantic poets and people like the chemist Humphrey Davies all had this frisson of interaction. It was absolutely. There's a great quote by Coleron that says, he's the poet, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and he said, I'm going to go to all Humphrey Davies lectures on chemistry. I'm going to hunt chemistry like a shark. And so they were really into it. And that I think we want to revive. So the humanities have a big role. I think if you read the humanities deeply and learn all the different ways in which people have been imposters and camouflaged, you could help a virologist figure out ways that viruses evade the host. So there are ways to cross the disciplines, but they're not just random free association. You have to understand and look at relations and structures. I mean, we have these seminars sometimes at Yale where people say, oh, what is consciousness? And they just kind of vaguely don't really get anywhere. But I think you need to really dive deeply into the models and understand the relational structures and how they can map over.
Carolyn, what's been something that has provided wonder for you over the last couple of weeks?
Oh, I mean, I shared a little bit that I have 2 small kids and we're doing so much work at Galileo. So I do often feel like I've got lots of plates spinning. And the thing that I have been aware of is the more present I am. And I don't know, Frank, if this is part of what you were sharing around your experience of spring, but if I'm, doing some Legos with the kids and I'm really focused on the Legos and on what we're building and on their experience of building the Legos, I do feel like a bit of awe and wonder around what we're building together and the way their brains are working and what they're creating. And what I'm noticing is like, if I can actually just tap in and be present, I can tap into wonder and awe almost immediately in any situation, but it's pretty difficult for me to be present because I feel like I've got so much going on in my head.
We all have that pressure. Even when our kids get full grown, if you have a very vigorous career, it's hard sometimes to step back, but it's so rewarding and it's helpful to you. It actually spawns creativity. I think it's important to have I go great lengths to define wonder the way I mean it, because it has different senses over the years. And I mean more than stupefied awe. I don't want you to be dumbstruck and kind of go, oh, far out. I want you to be, wow, this is exciting. Let me explore it. To be energizing. And that sometimes is hard when you're tired, but that's what you want. And when you listen to some of the great scientists and advocates over the centuries, people like Rachel Carson, who wrote The Silent Spring, or Richard Feynman, the physicist, or Jennifer Doudna, the CRISPR pioneer, They all talk about this incredible exuberance and excitement and a kind of awe, the appreciation of the beauty of complexity, but not a paralyzing one, an energizing and motivating one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if you just sort of say, I'm going to be a bit like my kid, I'm going to try to look at the world from their perspective. You don't have to be that cognitive or cerebral about it. You just have to share their point of view a bit, because they often ask questions that you'd never think of that are actually very interesting and give you a new perspective.
I have to say, for me, I think hosting salons, and by the nature of that, you ask a lot of questions, has really slowed me down when I'm out in day-to-day life, because I ask more questions constantly now. It's sort of a habit, and I think that allows me more opportunity to feel awe and wonder.
I'm a bore at cocktail parties because I always want to drill deeper. I can't stand talking about housing prices or trips that I've taken and how great I am. I want to know, what did you learn or what's going on? And that doesn't always go over well. Sometimes it does. You have to find a like-minded soul.
Goes over very well at salons, though. So that's what we're trying to build, a community like that with Post Talk. Is it best? Should we wonder alone or should we wonder with others? Does it matter?
You can do both. I think it's better with others. I have a lot of.
Okay, it's better as a group.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I talk a lot about how to wonder as a group. I talk in particular about arguing to win versus arguing to learn. Too often,
I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because I feel like culturally we are arguing to win. And so I'd just love to, dive a little bit more deeply there, Frank, around the distinction between arguing to learn and what that sounds like and how we can be in the practice of arguing to learn.
It's a big issue. Matt Fisher and I and Josh Noe wrote a paper in Scientific American a few years ago summarizing that research. When you argue to win, you tend to get black and white about the truth. You think there's no gray shades. It gets triggered often by getting emotional issues, often being in a public arena. So we can make you more mindful about arguing to learn by having it be more of a private conversation or something where you're not going to be potentially embarrassed. It's also just a matter of practice. What's the point of arguing to win? You don't learn anything. The whole point of arguing is not to achieve an accomplishment, but it can be to win. I mean, if you're an attorney, you have to win. So you argue to win in the courts. That's your job. But when you're arguing with a friend, it can be fun. Again, my lab meetings are often arguments, but they're never to hurt anybody or win. They're to uncover a truth and to be willing to change your mind. So again, you have to think about what your goal is and why. This win-win mentality as opposed to win-lose mentality is an important contrast. And much of our culture gets into this win-lose. It's a fixed sum, zero-sum game. If I win, the other guy has to lose. Lots of social interactions are win-wins, and we don't realize that. It has to do with international trade. It can do with a company. It can do all sorts of things. And I have another paper on that where we talk about how there's this real myth that somehow trade tariffs are good things, and they're only good if you think of the world as a zero-sum kind of situation, which it isn't. So arguing to win, I don't even think it's short-term. It's short-term. It doesn't sustain
a relationship. Joy. Yeah.
And there are studies done by Michael Tomasello and others suggesting that even preschoolers it's not our innate state. I think actually they're the opposite. And you can nurture it and make it happen.
What do you think about like the, you shared doing it in private. What do you think so much of how we debate and frankly communicate now happens in social media? And that's a very public forum and it's forever. What do you make of the fact that we're relying so much on social media to have these debates? And
you're asking a media the dinosaur. I don't do Twitter. I'm not on any social media. I simply don't do it.
And is that because it's not because there isn't any room for nuance and debating?
I frankly don't have the bandwidth. I just don't see how I could possibly engage in that. And
great comment here. You have to listen first and be open to learn to teach. That's right, Mike Farah. Very true.
That's right. The best teachers are the ones who are not dogmatic, who realize that teaching is a learning experience. But the media is a very interesting question. My students, grad students, and some of my colleagues lecture me all the time. I have to see what's going on. But every time I go, I say, well, this is endless. And there's an awful lot of bad stuff. And so I don't want to vet it all. I do make efforts. When I read a news story about something important, I'll usually look at 4 or 5 very, very different sources to make sure. So I've even said, is there any way that Putin could be making true claims about his invasion? So I've gone and read the narrative from that side. I thought about it seems so utterly crazy, but I feel an obligation to at least entertain the thought and stress it. And so if I did the social media that way, I think I'd go crazy because there's so
Right.
many crazy, nutty things to test. But everybody's doing it. I don't know how to solve it. There's a lot of work on misinformation and disinformation. People put up stickers saying, "Don't trust this source." People ignore it. We have a study showing that people know you should have multiple sources, but if all those sources come from a single prior source, they ignore that, even though that's just as contaminated as coming from a single source, if you see what I mean. So if one very biased person gives a news report and 3 people pick up on it, and you just talk to those 3, you think, oh, I got all this diversity of sources, but there's no diversity at all because they came from one single person. And people
And we
don't-
get lazy. We stop asking questions because we have less time.
Yeah, and again, that shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be rude.
Right.
But it's hard to ask those kinds of questions. So I do have a few websites I've looked at. There's a wonderful one called Explain It Like I'm 5. I think it's a
Explain it like I'm 5.
Yeah,
Let me see if I can add that. Okay, here, I'm gonna
and
just.
it's a Reddit site, and it says this, everyone should have an obligation to explain things in simpler terms. Some of the greatest scientists I've known, ones I had at MIT and other places, the most eminent, not always, but often had the clearest ways to explain things because they could put it in terms where they could manipulate more easily in their own heads and share it with others.
Oh, so, this is a Reddit. It's a Reddit group.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I think I can just.
I recently heard Brian Cox, the physicist, say that if a person can't make you understand, they don't understand it themselves.
Well, he's a wonderful example. His book,
Yeah.
The Planets, I've read very carefully. It got me. I always thought astronomy was kind of boring, especially planetary astronomy. Having read his book, I've changed my view of the planets completely. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you've gone. There's this thing about the tack of Jupiter. This hypothesis that Jupiter could have been rocketing in all the way to Mars and out again, and sort of broke up planets and maybe helped create the asteroid belt. So I mean, so yeah, he's a perfect example. I agree with him. I'm not sure all my colleagues who are great scientists would agree, but the ones that I find the most fun. I'll confide in you a kind of, I don't know, it's a secret, but something I thought about recently that shocked me. I was wondering why, as a biology major, I went into psychology, and I think part of the reason was I got so fascinated with how science works. The world is so complicated, our minds are so limited. And one of the things that got me so excited was a place called the F&T Diner. I haven't told this in length before. There was a little diner on the MIT campus right near the Kendall Square subway entrance. And it was a very inexpensive diner. There was a stew pot where I think what the legend was they just added meat every day and never cleaned it. And you'd go in and you'd sit in a little booth, and all around you would be the faculty debating the topics of the day, whether it was physics and biology or the Vietnam War. And I and a few undergraduates had gotten wind of this, but it was very inexpensive. There were a lot of blue-collar workers there, but you could listen to these people across the sciences vigorously debating and discussing and in clear and wonderful terms, because they had to explain across the disciplines. You had a physicist like Philip Morrison explaining to a biologist like Salvador Luria something about, I don't know what it was, but that got me thinking, how does this all work? How does science work, given how incredibly complex the world is? We have limited memories. We can't grasp it all. And so that's why I started to cognitive science of science. But the F&T Diner, it's now closed, sadly. But there's a little plaque. There's a little plaque on the wall near the subway entrance in Cambridge.
Maybe that could be a new salon series. You can call it F&T Diner and bring together scientists, and people can drop in and listen.
That would be a great idea. New Haven, I'm sure would
one of my favorite professors at MIT, Jerry Letvin, whose wife Maggie Letvin was a fitness instructor on Boston TV at the time. He gave he wrote a poem about the F&T Diner that I think you can find if you hunt it down. That's very, very funny and a little bit naughty. So
how does wonder affect, if it does, how does wonder and awe affect our overall physical health? Does it affect anything on inflammation? If we experience more wonder, does that bring down inflammation?
It's very interesting you asked that question. I try to, you said, did I wonder enough in the last month? I try to set goals about something that I should wonder that I haven't thought about before. And inflammation is one of the topics I got interested in recently because there's several types and so on. I don't know. Exercise is enormously important to inflammation. It has an vigorous, high intensity. I would say brain exercise, anything that gets the blood flowing. And we do know the brain from fMRI studies that there's more blood flow when you're working on hard problems or thinking things through. So I would imagine it does reduce inflammation. That's a totally data-driven claim. It's a speculation, but that's actually an interesting research project to give people hard problems. We know that taxi drivers, as opposed to bus drivers, have more active brain regions because they have to actually think of routes rather than follow fixed routes. And so they're probably getting more, they are getting more blood flow to those regions. So I think, yeah, anything that makes you more active and less passive is likely to be good.
That would be a point against using mapping services on our phones, right? We've all lost a sense of how to get from point A to point B
It's
on
depressing.
our own.
I've had to use maps a few times. I used to love maps. I used to put in all these navigation contests when I used to sell sailboats. And I do rely on GPSs far more than I should. I just pass through like a rat, turn right, turn left. And I need to get back to that. It's harder to read maps than you think if you don't do it for 40 years.
What about, I just wonder, what are two more questions? And if anyone who's listening live has any questions, just put them in the comments and we'll ask them. What's the relationship between wonder and the ego?
I think the best wondering is not having. It depends what you mean by ego. I don't mean to refer to ego, but being centered about yourself. You don't want to be that. You just want to. You don't care about your image. You just care about getting at the truth. So
and you're okay with being ignorant and showing. I mean, it takes a certain confidence to ask questions, right? Like at a cocktail party, to continue to drill down and show your ignorance takes a little bit of confidence, I think.
I guess. People. I don't think I'm overconfident when I do that. I think it requires a willingness to be wrong and not to be embarrassed.
Humility, a little bit of humility.
Humility, but also daringness. That's the weird thing about it. But I think you don't wonder with an agenda. The corrupted form of wondering is, I wonder how I could build a better cluster bomb. That's not the kind of wonder I want. I want to know what's there, what's out there in the world that makes the world so amazing and beautiful and explains its inner machinery. It's like I think we may even build on top of the way we like to build maps. Put a kid in a new house and they want to see every room. They want to see the layout. And the same way we want to see the causal layout. There's no agenda beyond just getting the knowledge, the knowing and understanding. When you put an agenda on top, like you want to master somebody or you want to win something, that corrupts it. So when
that year and a half ago, we did a salon, a digital salon like this with, I think it's Alison Gopnik at Berkeley. And she's a psychologist there.
Oh, I know her very well.
Children. Yeah, I'm sure. And I recall her saying about one's life cycle, explore as kids, you exploit as an adult, as midlife, and then you're back to exploration as you get older.
If you're lucky. That's what you should do.
If you're lucky, right? There we go.
I think that last phase is important. Some people grip onto their declining power and positions and think that's all that matters. But, wonder is free in terms of material resources. And I do have a section of the book on the great polymaths in history. And almost every one of them on their deathbed just went, well, what about this? I still haven't figured this out. They didn't care about, any of their possessions or anything else. They just wanted to know. And they couldn't help stop. And I've met people like this. I think I wonder a fair bit. But there are people who make me feel embarrassed that I veg out and sometimes watch a stupid TV show that has no content. And so I've been having this debate with my friends about whether I should be reading fiction. Because, if you're into trying to learn about the world, why should you read fiction? And I said, I've decided when thinking about it, fiction is fabulous if you learn something. If you learn something about the human nature, if you learn something about different possible worlds. I just read this wonderful piece of fiction by a French author whose name I cannot remember, called The Heart. And it's about heart transplant.
Was it a translation? Or?
Yes, it's a gorgeous translation. And it's about how the heart transplant industry and organ transplant industry has transformed our notion of what it means to die. Because I used to think when the heart stopped, it meant, but now it's brain death. It is a gorgeous, great book. It was nominated for all sorts of awards. And so I learned a huge amount about death and life and what it means to be alive, morality, the huge moral decisions, like who should decide what. Anyway, you have to read the book. But so I really try to embrace the humanities and the social science in this book, even though I think ultimately there's a center of gravity in the hard sciences where wonder gets the most immediate feedback.
I know we're running out of time, but if we have time for one more question before we potentially open it up, I'm wondering about how you think about the amount of information that we take in and the impact that has on our decision making. So part of what I do at Galileo is on the marketing side of things, and so we're constantly thinking about decreasing someone's cognitive load, like making an easy decision for people. And I'm just wondering, in your research and in gathering information, what you've seen that does for people in terms of their decision making, having so much information, access to so much information.
This is a very complex question. I haven't fully figured out. Let me tell you a counter story. We did a study recently, it appeared in a major journal, which gave kids as young as 5 adult Votech videos of how an internal combustion engine worked. It was a 7-minute video showing all the details, the spark plugs, the valves, the carburetor. It was probably 1,000 different events. And we showed this to adults and they said, don't show that to kids, they'll hate it, they'll walk out of the room. Well, we redid the narrative so it was more friendly terms, but it was the same content. Well, first of all, they adored it. They were glued to it. And no, they didn't remember all the details, but they abstracted away some general principles that they didn't know before that are very powerful. Like in most engines, if one part speeds up, the other parts speed up. There isn't a trade-off. You don't get one part speeding up and another part slowing down. It doesn't work the way other devices do. And they developed these abstractions. So what's the moral there? You don't always want to strip everything away to its utter simplicity. Ultimately, that's what you do. Ultimately, you have to get abstractions. But you want to realize that in children in the world see complexity everywhere, and they have to start getting good at getting just themselves, learn to extract it. Now, in medical decision-making, I can see the problem. And by the way, that's the thing I'm really deeply into, because I'm the doctor's worst nightmare. I always ask them why and how does disease work? And a few doctors smile and get delighted, but lots look nervously at their watch and say, I got this guy for 12 minutes or else my salary is going to get docked because I don't see my 45 patients a day. And so I think it's a big issue, and maybe you're providing just a service to streamline that. But I think it's a very tricky one because, I mean, what are you angling at? What's your thought about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, for me, it's about identifying those moments in time in any person's given experience, about giving them enough information to be interested, to be engaged, and then be able to strip it down a bit more so that they can make the decisions that they need to make. But they need to have the right information at the outset to be able to feel like they're informed and engaged in the process and the experience.
Yeah, I think that being partners in medical decision making is what everybody says, but very few people actually implement. Time and time again, when I really try to drill down with the doctor, I don't blame them; they don't have the time. But I want to be a partner, and they're often dismissive. Well, I've had 20 years doing this. I drove my cataract surgeon crazy because I was asking detailed questions. She said, I encourage you to ask questions. I love it when patients ask questions. And then in the middle of surgery, I was asking questions, and she said, I had to up your medication because you were getting us all distracted. so you can overdo it. But I'd love to do that.
So I think let's do one more question, and then I think we'll wrap up. I want to hop over a little bit to another topic. But I think maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, you did some research around internet searches and a sense of our own intelligence. Can you tell us a little bit about that research?
The audio winked out. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Our sense of our own intelligence.
Internet searches and a sense of our own.
Oh,
yeah. I think you did that a few years ago. Internet. So can you give us a little bit of explanation of what that was?
That was a surprising study. And I'll tell you how it happened. I live in Connecticut on a peninsula that sticks out in Long Island Sound. And for 2 years in a row, we were cut off from the internet. Everything was cut off. I had no cell service because of where we are, because it flooded. And so everybody was in that neighborhood of about 100 houses cut off for about a week at one point. And I felt myself getting stupider every day. And I started to realize how dependent I was on the internet to supplement my knowledge. 40 or 50 years ago, it was that old 1939 encyclopedia in Britannica in the basement. But we threw that away a long time ago. We couldn't keep the space. And so we did a study showing that when you Google things, you inflate and confuse what's out there with what's inside your head. And so you misattribute what's outsourced to be what's in your head. And you only do it for stuff that's Googleable. So if you Google something like, I don't know, how does mitochondria work? You will think maybe you know more about the heart, something even unrelated. But you won't think you'll know more about why your mom chose your father to get married, because you know that wouldn't be on Google. So you just expand what is reasonable to be on Google. And it's a surprisingly strong effect. We don't know how long it lasts. We think it probably decays over the rest of the day. But we tend to think of ourselves more as lone wolf cognitive creatures going out there foraging in the world, and underestimate how much we're dependent on other minds, how much we need to kind of connect to other minds and rely on them. But to do that requires having a lot inside our heads as well. We can't just surrender. We have to know who knows what. Look at the lay of the land, the division of cognitive labor. You know, when Adam Smith talked about the division of physical labor, there was a simplistic division of cognitive labor that we all need to master. And so I think getting to the Carolyn's company does, you need to know, well, who are the specialists in the discipline? Who do I approach? You know, lots of turf battles on some procedures. And so can you have a sense of what's in play there, why you should care?
I think that's an interesting point to end on, that it's better collectively. Our intelligence is better collectively rather than on our own. And being connected to our community is much better for moving forward than doing it on our own. here's Frank's book. It's called Wonder. Frank Keil. He's a psychologist, professor of psychology at Yale. The book is out. You should buy it. Yes, it came out from MIT Press.
And plaudits to the artist who did that cover, by the way. I always loved that cover.
It's a wonderful cover. It's a wonderful cover, and my book is all marked up. So definitely buy it. We love to support our authors here on Postdoc.
Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, Frank. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you, guys.
And to Galileo for encouraging us to do these salons. This initially came out from a conversation of wanting to do a series of salons to sort of take apart the thinking of binary thinking, but the discussion in the gray area. And so I think obviously having some curiosity, awe, and wonder about what's in front of us encourages us not to just think black and white.
You might like to take a glance at this Scientific American article, because it's all about that seeing gray by arguing to learn.
What's the name of it?
I think the tribalism of truth. I think it was about 2 years ago. The first author is Matthew Fisher, Josh Knope, Ken O'B, and me. And it's all about gray and black and white, and how arguing to learn forces you into a black and white mindset, and arguing to learn forces you into much more of a gray mindset, because you appreciate that there's going to be some value in the other person.
Good title.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We're going to end on that. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.